Okay guys, let's take a look at some scenarios here dealing with recessionary and inflationary gaps, and we're going to use what we've learned in previous discussions of how to solve these problems. All right, so here we go. Scenario number one, your economy is experiencing a recession, and this recession has been as a result of a lack of spending. So what we want to do is we want to show two graphs here to represent the recession. First of all, let's show the long-run aggregate supply curve in a recession. And what we can see from this graph is that essentially our economy has fallen into this recession as a result of a lack of aggregate demand. So this is what it would have looked like had we started in long run and shifted to the recession. However, we started in the recession. Let's go ahead and eliminate that aggregate demand curve. Okay, so we're in the recession on the long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. Now let's do it with the production possibility curve model. Now this is a much simpler model, one we learned early on in the year, but you can see that this point here, A, represents being inside the curve, and that represents a recession in our production possibility curve. So now effectively we have illustrated both the long run model and the PPC in a recession. So here we need to explain now what will happen if policymakers allow this economy to automatically adjust toward long-run equilibrium with no active stabilization measures. In order to get back to long run, both wages and prices, input costs, must become flexible downward. So basically what was stuck or sticky at a point in long run initially has now become flexible downward. In other words, workers will now accept lower wages as their wage demands fall. And once wage demands come down and prices become flexible downward, then businesses can rehire and then they can increase output back to their normal level. So what ends up happening is your short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right as these input costs and wage demands come down. So our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, bringing us back to equilibrium at point B. Scenario number one, we were in a recession. We went into a self-correcting economy that automatically adjusted back to long run. Okay, continuing on with scenario one, now we need to explain if the Federal Reserve and the federal government wanted to get us back to long run and not allow the economy to automatically adjust, what could they do? Well, we know the Federal Reserve would buy bonds through open market operations, and the federal government would lower taxes and increase spending. So here we have the money market graph on the left and the long run model on the right. And so what we want to illustrate here is the Federal Reserve buying bonds. So here's our increase in the money supply, shifting it to the right, bringing down interest rates, and what impact that will have on aggregate demand. As interest rates go down, that stimulates interest-sensitive spending on the behalf of the consumers and the businesses, which then increases the C and the I component of aggregate demand. So this would be represented as a shift to the right in aggregate demand caused by the increase in bond purchases by the Fed, reducing interest rates and causing the consumer and the investment portion of aggregate demand to increase or shift to the right in this case. Now let's take the government. If the government decides to increase the G component of aggregate demand, they may have to borrow from the loanable funds pool to do so. So let's just assume that they did. And the government says, hey, we've got to borrow to increase this G component of aggregate demand and get the economy back to where it should be. So what we're going to have here is we're going to have the two representative samples of what a budget deficit looks like on a loanable funds graph. Remember from other videos, the federal government is borrowing from the pool, then we would say there's less supply in the pool or a shift to the left of the supply curve, or we would say there's an increase in demand for the loanable funds. Either one of those is acceptable to illustrate a budget deficit. All right, so here we go. Now we have scenario number two. Scenario number two says our economy is experiencing an economic boom. So what we're going to have here is we're going to have inflation in the economy. But notice in this graph, we're beginning in long-run equilibrium. How are we going to illustrate the inflationary gap? Well, what I would need to do is shift my aggregate demand curve to the right. And as I shift to the right, I can see that I move from A to B along the supply curve or the short-run supply curve. And this increase in aggregate demand leads to a temporary increase in output as well as inflationary conditions. Again, this is an inflationary gap. Okay, so our economy is in this inflationary gap. Now, in this example, we're going to allow the economy to self-correct or to automatically stabilize. So the government and the Fed are going to leave it alone, laissez-faire, and let it allow itself to correct. What eventually is going to occur is that as a result of these inflationary conditions stripping the value of money, people in the labor force are eventually going to increase their demands for wages. So, as individuals recognize the value of their money has diminished, they need more money. Even though wages were sticky at point A, now they are adjusting their expectations of inflation upward and their wages are becoming flexible upward. In other words, they want more money from their employer. Additionally, all of those prices for our pizza company that represented the dough cost being inexpensive relative to the new conditions in the economy and disequilibrium, those come up as well. And so our pizza company has to lay off workers because they want more money, and they have to cut back on the amount of pizzas they make because the pizza's costs have come up, or they can't supply where they once did. So we represent this by a shift to the left of the supply curve, the LRAS, as a result of the higher input costs. That is, wages are now higher and input prices like dough are higher. And so our short-run supply curve shifts to the left, leading us from A to B and then B to C. So here we have a self-correcting economy or automatically adjusting back to long run. Now, if we were in scenario 2 with this inflationary conditions and we wanted to explain what the Federal Reserve and the federal government could do to adjust us back to long run, basically we would say, hey, look, the Fed is going to reduce the amount of money in the money supply and the federal government is going to reduce spending and increase taxes. But if the Fed reduces the amount of money in the money supply, what is the impact of that on aggregate demand? Well, if interest rates are going up, that means consumers and businesses will cut back on their borrowing. In fact, some people will actually prefer to save as a result of the higher interest rates. So the Federal Reserve would sell bonds through the open market, and the government would increase taxes and then reduce government spending. To graph this, the government would be running a budget surplus. So in this case, I think it is appropriate to say there would be more money in the pool. And so if there's more money in the pool of loanable funds, we'll see the supply of loanable funds increase, that pool fills up, and then anytime you have more of something, that something becomes less expensive. In this case, that would be the interest rates. The interest rates are lower, therefore people are going to have an easier time borrowing money as a result of the surplus the government is running. Scenario number 3, our economy is going to experience a negative supply shock. Notice we're in long-run equilibrium initially, and then we experience this supply shock. Well, what causes supply shock? The supply shock was a result of turmoil in the Middle East, which causes OPEC to cut oil production. So this is going to lead to a reduction in the short-run aggregate supply curve for oil and the input costs that exist as a result of oil prices being higher. Now, if the economy does not have as much oil, then all the things that are derived from oil, be it gasoline, jet fuel, are going to be more expensive. And if those things are more expensive, we cannot produce where we once did. Output will fall, unemployment will rise, prices will rise. This is an example of stagflation. So stagflation hits, and that is represented by a shift to the left in the short-run aggregate supply curve. If I were to show this with a PPC model, this would be something inside the production possibility curve, representing a temporary reduction in the ability to produce where we once did. Now, let's say that our economy has experienced a short-run supply shock for a couple of years, and the federal government and the Federal Reserve decide we need to get back to long run. We've been in this stagflating economy for several years. Let's get us back to long run. All right, so what is the Fed going to do to get us back to long run? Well, they cannot affect the short-run aggregate supply, but they can affect the aggregate demand curve. So what the Fed would do is the Fed would buy bonds through open market operations, shifting the money supply to the right, bringing down interest rates, allowing consumers and businesses more access to credit they can borrow and spend. The government would lower taxes and increase the G component of aggregate demand, and both of these actions by the Fed and the federal government would help and allow the AD curve to shift back to the right. So we get AD back to the right, back to long run, but here we have sort of a negative byproduct of these policies, being that prices are now higher. So we have increased inflation as a result of the Fed's buying bonds and the government's action. Nonetheless, we're back at long run and we have a fully employed economy. Okay, let's wrap this up with scenario 4. Scenario 4 says your economy is in a recession. Policymakers estimate that aggregate demand is $100 billion short of long-run output. So if we want to get back to long run, we need to shift our AD curve to the right by $100 billion. So let's figure out how much the government has to spend or cut taxes in order to get back to that desired amount. In this case, we know our MPC is 0.75. So our multiplier is going to be 1 over 0.25. 1 over 0.25 is 4, and they have a $100 billion gap. So we're going to take 100 divided by 4, And so what does the government need to spend in order to get us out of this recession? They need to spend $25 billion. Okay, in our second example, we have an MPC of 0.8. So in order to get my spending multiplier, I'm taking 1 over the MPS, or 1 over 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is 5. Now, in order to close this gap, the government needs to spend a certain amount of money. They don't need to spend $100 billion. They need to spend an amount that will multiply 5 times to get to $100 billion. So I just do a little division. 100 over 5 is 20. And so in this example, the government needs to spend $20 billion in order to close that gap. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and the different scenarios that you can potentially see on the AP exam and how we can close these inflationary and recessionary gaps using the multiplier formula and the multiplier concept.